I have some questions, and maybe I'll be asking him some. While I'm doing so, the audience, please, if you have any questions, you can put your questions. You can do this by a button at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so while I'm asking him questions, please think about your questions. I have learned quite a bit about the supply chain disruptions from very interesting, illuminating talk by Professor Baldwin. First, I guess, I just like to maybe give you some of the very important findings that I found. As the title of this paper that we are looking at, Horses for Courses, and you have to use the appropriate indicator to examine the specific question. Yeah, one, I guess, good example is trading value added. It's a very useful tool that the economists use, but Richard Baldwin is proposing a different measure based on production or sales, I guess, production. And if you are interested in the impacts of supply chain on like employment or value added, of course, you should use that information, data on trading value added. But if you are interested, as we are interested in the impacts of supply chain disruptions on the economy or the production, you should use the one Professor Baldwin is proposing. And here, he had three very important points. Well, one of them is to look at the face value indicator versus look-through value indicators. And here, although Professor Baldwin didn't talk about this, I guess, about the data for Japan, I found, I think the data on Japan regarding, say, exposure to China using face value and using look-through value in the paper that we are looking at. It's an NBR paper. If I'm not mistaken, just to give you, for the audience, for Japan, the dependence on China or exposure to China using face value is 3.0%, whereas a look-through value is 4.2%, which is a bit larger, greater than those compared for the US. But what is interesting is, say, Korea, the numbers are higher. Face value is 5.1%, look-through value is 7.0%. So Korea is more exposed to China. And what I found very interesting is Mexico. Mexico, the number is 7.1 and 7.8. So, we observe that there are a lot of inputs going from China to Mexico and then possibly to the United States. So looking at this look-through value, we find a number of interesting things. And on the U.S. exposure to China, again, I may be wrong. If I'm wrong, please correct me. Although, U.S. exposure to China, it has grown or increased, still it's not that big. According to Professor Baldwin's figure, U.S. exposure to foreign countries is 12.3%, whereas for China, 3.5%. So depending on how you look at it, it's an aggregate, it's not that big. Maybe for specific sectors, some of the U.S. exposure to China is quite big. Again, the numbers come from Brookings' paper. For clothing industry, 6.3%, electric equipment, 5.5%, vehicles, 5.1%, so on. So depending on the sector, this U.S. exposure to China varies. And again, so these are some of the interesting observations that I obtained from reading very interesting papers, NBR paper and Brookings paper. And now I'd like to maybe ask Professor Baldwin some questions. Although I don't think you mentioned robustness and resilience when you talk about the impacts of supply chain disruptions. If you could just spend a few minutes just explaining to us the difference between robustness and resilience, and I think it is important to know whether the purpose of the business or purpose of the government to deal with supply chain disruption is either robustness or resilience. And are they complement, substitutes? What should the government or what should the business care about, robustness or resilience? So this is one question I wanted to ask you. Another question related to this, although I guess you talked about the government policy toward the supply chain disruptions, many countries are using subsidies, say, to deal with semiconductors. And as we all know, if the government keep on providing subsidies, that would cause problem. I mean, maybe overspending, or that's possibility. What should the government do? Should the governments in the world discuss what the appropriate subsidy that they should try to look at? Fiscal problem, that's another. So again, how should the governments in the world deal with subsidies? All the countries wants to provide subsidy to deal with supply chain disruptions, but if all countries did that, it kind of race to the bottom kind of situation. So how do you think about that? Now, okay, just one more information. Professor Todo of Waseda University did a very interesting paper for a RIETI discussion paper about the possible impacts of supply chain disruptions coming from China on the Japanese economy. And he looked at the very detailed linkage between companies, company-based data, very interesting one. And the impact is huge, as a matter of fact. If 2 months worth of imports were disrupted, that would have negative impacts on Japanese GDP by like 15% or so. So it's huge. So that kind of study is done here. Maybe later if you want to take a look at it.
Sure, I definitely do. Yeah, thank you.
And another thing he found important, interesting, it is like a local or business, links within Japan. Of course, not only China and Japan, but inside Japan, inter-business linkages, inter-business transactions. That really, has a very negative. That will magnify the impact of this supply chain disruptions. I think I've stated too long. So if you can just maybe let me just summarize. If you can give us something, your idea about what the government policy should be regarding the ways to deal with supply chain disruptions. That's one, I guess.
I took careful notes, so
okay.
I have an idea.
All right.
Thank you very much for that, Hirata-sensei. Take me an hour and a half to answer all your wonderful questions, and will lead us to think hard and revise the papers in the future. So let me just go through a little bit in the order. So you mentioned we looked at gross flows, and that was focusing on production disruption. But if you were thinking about employment shocks, it should be value added. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we have a whole family of measures, one of which is the foreign production exposure to value added. Mm-hmm. And so we have those are all up. Like that was the horses for courses. Is you choose the right indicator for the question you have in mind, and we have one indicator for that. And we also in that paper show how to derive other indicators depending upon other shocks like connectivity or whatever. So that's a point that's just, yes, that's right. On your second point about it's not so big, in Brookings we ended it with it's bigger than you thought, but not that big.
Yeah, right.
Because the real truth is every large manufacturing economy is relatively self-sufficient in intermediates. It's just the way it is. So between 80-85% in US, Japan, Germany, China. But once you get to smaller countries, those numbers can be much, much higher. So it's you know, is it big or is it small? It's bigger than you thought. That was our point when we left. So robustness versus resilience. So this is something that's super well accepted inside the logistics, supply chain risk management. And robustness means you can keep the show going no matter what, the shock. So think about electricity supply in a hospital.
Right.
And resilience is, you know, the power goes out in this suburb and you get it back online as fast as possible. So robustness is the show must go on, and resilience is we'll get back as fast as possible. Now the difference there is the strategies you engage in. So in a hospital, they have alternative generators, they have alternatives to the alternative generators, they even have batteries. And so they engage in incredibly expensive policies to make sure it keeps going. Whereas resilience, they make sure that they have people on call to fix the lines and all that sort of stuff. It's much less expensive, but it's a different strategy overall. And I think in the public debate, at least in the US, they're using the word resilience for everything. And people should kind of think hard about whether you want to be able to snap back quickly or not. On Todo Sensei's paper, I hadn't seen that, but it doesn't surprise me. The shortcoming of our measures is that they're incredibly aggregate. And yet supply shocks are really very specific. So we view ours as just kind of a early warning system. There's certain sectors where it's not that big of an issue, so you wouldn't there. But if it indicates that they might be a big issue, taking account of all the linkages, then maybe you should spend some more time tracking it down like Todo-san did.
Right.
So I agree with that very much. Now the local business lines, we can look at sector to sector in Japan, and there is a dependence, but we don't have regional input-output data to do that. Some countries do. I know Japan does and China does. So you could do region-to-region shocks with that data, but that's not the data we use to start with. So I think and the policy, yeah. So subsidies, you know, governments pay subsidies for things all the time, arts, education. Sometimes it's worth it, sometimes it's not. And that should be an open and data-based discussion as to whether it's worth it or not. And I think so much of the policies that we've seen on supply chain resilience in the last couple of years are just a knee-jerk reaction, which probably won't work. Because, for example, I think it may work in semiconductors in some countries, but to do that, you're going to have to spend billions for 10 years. And then make sure that the demand stays up for these things. Otherwise, there was a famous 3M face mask industry that was set up in Minnesota in an emergency way, and now is completely unemployed because everybody went to buying cheap masks from China. So you have to be serious about it, and that's what I think the important thing is. So multilateral issues. So there are certain issues where coordination is really important and would be useful. So one thing that's true and public good is information about supply chain, who sells to whom and where the shocks are. So you can think about the analogy with weather buoys that are all around, and people share the information from the weather buoys, and that makes everybody better off. And the argument to have a multilateral cooperation to observe supply chain shocks and know who sells to whom, that might be a very good idea. Now, the race to the bottom may or may not be a bad thing. If there is really an externality, let's say in green transition, then if everybody starts spending a lot on green transition, that might actually be good. It's overcoming the free rider effect with race to the bottom. So who knows? But I'll stop right there.
Okay, so we received questions.
Okay.
I guess you see them too?
Yeah.
The first one, the trade-off curve you explained was impressive. However, in reality, measuring risk is practically difficult. do you have any idea on the measurement of supply chain reception?
Yeah, I have very good ideas. Ask somebody else who actually knows about the industry you're talking about. Because that risk, of course, is completely different for car industry than it is for the agricultural industry. So I'm not the expert to answer that question.
Okay, the second question, how do you see the room for international cooperation or rule making to cope with supply chain issues, supply chain disruptions, I guess, in this case?
Yeah, so there is some coordination in like this friend-shoring stuff, and there's some initiatives. And I think there is a potential for it, and especially when it comes to systemic shocks. These aren't just national issues; they're international issues. So that's, the natural argument for some sort of multilateral coordination is very clear here. But we live in a world where multilateral coordination is not so easy to do. And so, whether it's going to happen or not, I think there is some already initiatives in APEC and G7.
Indo-Pacific.
The Indo-Pacific thing.
The Biden administration.
Right, so they're talking about that kind of stuff. So it's possible. And useful. There's a very clear argument for coordination because it's not a nation-specific problem.
Right, and the third one is the data available through organizations like WTO. I guess you said.
So it's on the OECD website. So it's called TIVA, T-I-V-A. So it stands for Trade and Value Added, and they've added all of our indicators there. And we use their database to. You have to do a little bit of matrix algebra to get this look-through thing, but it's all up there now.
Good. The most recent version.
The most recent came out like a month ago or something.
Right. Good.
No, they're serious. I got some more. Given the dominance of Chinese intermediates, do you think it would be realistic to truly diversify supply chains away from China in the look-through rather than face value sense through industrial policies? How could that be done? So you only get one question. You don't get 4 questions in one question. So I'm going to go with this one. Is it realistic to diversify away from China? And I think we have an omelet, a beautiful omelet, global supply chains all over the world, and we are not going to get the eggs back from that because it's just too integrated, and I think you're picking that up. And although it's a relatively small amount of the overall share, that's because those are aggregate numbers, and if you look at particular sectors, it can be quite elaborate. So I view that as, it's going to be very difficult, very expensive, and may not work if what you wanted to do was completely decouple China from the rest of the world. So you saw that China is now producing 35% of the entire world industrial intermediate inputs. And you can't replace that overnight. These are huge agglomerations and things like that. So I think the way the U.S. is, I think the current administration at least has figured this, has realized this, and their approach is to limit it to very few things. They call small garden with a high fence. And so they've limited it really to advanced semiconductors, anything to do with quantum computing, and the most advanced AI, like ChatGPT and those sorts of things. And there the U.S. is quite explicitly trying to prevent China from going into it, but they welcome other stuff. And the other way that the U.S. is, the U.S. is, by the way, is obviously the one who's starting most of this conflict and driving it forward. But so the other way they've recognized it is they use the phrase, intense competition requires intense diplomacy. And so they're, the Biden-Xi was an example of where they're talking, hoping that this thing doesn't spin out of control, as has happened in the past. Little conflicts on this and that spin into the whole thing, and people get very excited. But and who knows what happens when if Trump gets reelected? That will be a completely different world than if Biden gets reelected. But I think it's not going to be possible to decouple from China. It's not possible. It's not in anybody's interest to do so. But the world, in living memory, people have done much more stupid things than that. So and that's not impossible, but let's hope it's not. And it would be very costly. This is the goal. The second one is the golden handcuffs argument, and that is interdependence makes it possible for the opponent to weaponize that interdependence to force you to do things, but it also makes it expensive for them to disengage. So I've always been of the school that more trade makes it less likely that people actually fight. But it obviously can go the other way, and the U.S. is definitely weaponizing lots of interdependence. China has too on a number of occasions. So that's, it's not clear which way it goes. But in any case, I think it's worthwhile recognizing this is not like the U.S. and the Soviet Union did almost no trade.
Right.
So they were not integrated. And this is like to try and separate it. Or another way to think about it is what happened with Brexit. So Brexit was a disaster for British industry and is a continuing disaster for the economy.
Right.
And that was something that might happen if you tried to decouple completely from China. Do you want to choose one of these?
Okay. Well, I think you responded to many of them, no? All of them?
Was it a risk wage one? So risk wage model suggesting that when the government is more risk sensitive than private companies, it leads to a reduction in reward, and it's very interesting. Would the assessment of risk reward, both government and private sector, align if they shared information? Okay, that's a good point, which I didn't, there's another part on this chart, so that if I can maybe go back up to this one. There we go. Okay, so you see that solid blue line that's curving up like that. It's labeled perceived risk and reward frontier.
Right.
And one of the problems with supply chains is even the biggest companies don't know their supply chain. So even like a GM will only know two-tier suppliers because it gets like exponentially large. And so it's possible that the true line is higher up. In other words, there's more risk for every reward than you think. So the companies think they're at P, but they're actually much higher risk. And so information sharing would be a no regret idea to go through that. And moreover, it's subject to public-private sort of thing. So information on who's buying from whom is by the companies often viewed as private information. But if everybody shared it, it would be much better off.
And you have that in Brookings' paper.
Yeah, we talk about it in the Brookings paper to sort of share information sharing, or at least investigation would be really useful. There was a couple of examples people have found when they looked up the value chain, and they would find like this particular product depended upon one producer of this particular thing, and it wasn't just one company; it was all the companies in the industry that depended upon it. So sharing of information and gathering information is like almost a no-winner.
Right.
That's the first information on the links. The second information is on the shocks. So if it's the Panama Canal, everybody reads about it in the newspaper. But there can be smaller shocks. Let's say the CEO of a company passes away, or there's a particular something in some country that could be very disruptive. Sharing that information in a very reliable way would be something that's probably a good idea. So yeah, I think that would help a lot.
Right. And I think government has a responsibility to really share the information that they have with the private sector if they want private sector to behave appropriately, don't you think?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's let me give you an example with Rebecca's employer, the Bank of England. So they've decided that supply chains are a risk to financial stability. Because if the people the British banks are lending to go bankrupt or have to shut down for 2 months. So now the Bank of England is asking their banks to do supply chain scenarios. And what do they call that? Risk testing? No, they call it stress testing. Stress testing. Right. So the Bank of England is requiring banks to do stress testing on the companies. And what we would like is that stress test is released. But you can imagine that the companies and the banks don't want to release that information. But it might be some way of sharing that without and these, as we've seen with the inflation, these have macro consequences. So it probably is something we really should share. I have a couple more slides if there's no more questions. So here. This is the numbers you were talking about. This is from the Brookings paper.
Oh, I see. Right. I see.
So this is look-through exposure to China is 3.8 times higher than the face value. And what the chart shows is that the top line is China, and then it's descending, which the hidden exposure is for Taiwan, Korea, Japan are still above 3. Even India is a big supplier of precursors of pharmaceuticals, and so that's important. And the curious one down at the bottom is there's hidden exposure of the U.S. to the U.S.
Yeah.
And what that is the U.S. makes stuff, exports the intermediates, they get put into intermediates that then they re-import. And that doesn't ever get measured. So it's a kind of one of these things. Anyways, and then here is this idea of different measures lead to different answers.
Yeah.
So here, the question is U.S. versus China as the top industrial supplier in the world. In the right chart, we use the observed, the face value, and you can see U.S. is still more prevalent than China, at least in 2018. If you use the look-through measure, China passed the U.S. back in 2000, but in the 2000s. And if you look at the look-through with value-added basis, that's the one I was talking about for employment, the U.S. is still ahead. So this is in our horses for courses. If you ask the
another
same
interesting point is Japan. Japan line is declining
the whole time, yeah. But so this is
very interesting.
This is for the whole world. Well, Japan sent a lot of your intermediate production to China. So that was the classic thing is there was only the most sophisticated parts were made in Japan. They were exported to China, and then China put them into stuff that then was like, say, a lens in a camera, which then exported. So that's why I think Japan's been going down in real terms.
Okay, I think well, we can go on and on, but time is limited, and I think we should stop. Again, thank you very much for very interesting presentation and discussions. Thank you very much for your participation, the audience, in our special seminar today. And once again, I'd like to really thank Professor Spalding for an exciting, interesting, illuminating presentation. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.